Press Conference USA on the Voice of America. Newsmakers from America and around the world speak with journalists in an unscripted and unrehearsed discussion about the critical issues facing the United States and the world. Here is your host on this edition of Press Conference USA, Carol Castiel.
Welcome to Press Conference USA on the Voice of America. Joining me on the program is VOA Senior Middle East Correspondent Meredith Buell. On this edition of the program, Turmoil in Egypt. Our guest, Jonathan Schanzer. He's Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a policy group based here in Washington. He's an expert on North Africa and the Middle East. He previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He's also the author of 2 books focusing on conflict in the Middle East, Hamas versus Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine, and Al-Qaeda's armies, Middle East affiliate groups, and the next generation of terror. Well, a year after coming to office, Egypt's first democratically elected president was ousted by the military. The removal of Mohamed Morsi followed days of mass protests by people who accused him of becoming increasingly authoritarian, pursuing an Islamist agenda, and failing to tackle Egypt's economic woes. Egyptians and outside observers continue to argue about what exactly has happened in the world's most populous Arab country. Was it a popular revolt against an increasingly authoritarian Muslim Brotherhood, or a counter-revolution of the old regime, which some analysts have said is tantamount to a military coup? Mr. Morsi's rule began unraveling when crowds of millions gathered in the streets of Egypt's cities on June 30th, the anniversary of his time in power. The army has since appointed top judge Adli Mansour as interim leader. He, in turn, has named former finance minister Hazem el-Biblawi as his prime minister. Mr. Mansour has set a timetable for the country to hold parliamentary elections early next year, followed by a presidential ballot. He also said a referendum will take place within 5 months to ratify amendments to the country's constitution. Meantime, 51 people died in clashes between the military and supporters of Mohamed Morsi in Cairo last week near the Republican Guard headquarters. Muslim Brotherhood officials said the army opened fire without reason. A military spokesman said troops fired only after coming under heavy gunfire from Morsi's supporters. What is certain is that Egypt is once again in turmoil. Current events have major implications, not only for Egypt, but for the future of political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course the entire region. Already regional players are vying for influence. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, no friends of the Muslim Brotherhood, have pledged support for the new interim regime to the tune of more than $12 billion in grants and loans. On the other hand, Qatar and Turkey, who sympathize with political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, see the removal of Mohamed Morsi as a strategic setback. Meanwhile, the White House says it is taking its time to determine how it regards the change of power in Egypt. Under U.S. law, the administration would be obligated to cut off more than $1 billion in aid if it determines that the military carried out a coup. Well, we'll talk with Jonathan Schanzer about the ouster of Mohamed Morsi, the implications for the Muslim Brotherhood, and the future of Egypt, and much, much more. And Jonathan Schanzer joins us here at the VOA Broadcast Center in Washington. Jonathan, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Carol.
And I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Meredith Buell.
Great to be here as always. Thanks, Carol.
Well, Jonathan Schanzer, let's take a look at what happened in Egypt. The Egyptian army claims that it had no choice but to overthrow the country's first legitimately elected president, and that the removal, I've heard the word coup-volution, that the removal reflected the will of the Egyptian people, since most Egyptians deplored the ineptness of the Morsi government. But the question is, even if the army and the people purported to represent the best of intentions, isn't deposing the country's first democratically elected president a dangerous precedent to set? Weren't there other options to have exhausted?
As you, I think, indicated, this is obviously a very complex situation that has taken place over the past year in Egypt. I think it's probably first important to note that Mohamed Morsi violated the trust of the Egyptian people during the year that he was in power. He tried to basically hijack the judiciary, was planning on sacking several hundred judges and replacing them with Muslim Brotherhood loyalists. He had made several controversial moves in terms of appointing governors throughout the country that many were opposed to, and in general left the anti-Islamist Islamist opposition out of the process in terms of constructing the new constitution, as well as other key components of Egyptian governance. All the while, the Egyptian economy cratered. There was no indication that Morsi was willing to restructure the debts in a way that looked responsible to those who cared about the way things were going. And so the frustration boiled over. And so on June 30th, you had this Tamarud movement, this rebellion movement came out. They brought 22 million people in the streets. This is a huge number. The goal of Tamarud was to bring out more than 13 million, which was apparently the number that Morsi secured with the election of last year. So in other words, they brought out that number and then quite a bit more, another 9 million people more, all opposed to Morsi's rule. And so these protests took place over the course of several days. I was personally shocked at how quickly the military moved in, disappointed that there was no compromise. In other words, they could have called for early elections. Other measures could have been taken before bringing him down. And the concern that we have right now is that it was a complete lack of regard for these new institutions that Egypt worked so hard to put in place after the fall of Hosni Mubarak in 2011. So in other words, this looks like a step backwards. At the same time, it's very hard to argue with the fact that Morsi had violated the trust of the Egyptian people.
I'm going to turn to Meredith Buell for a question.
Jonathan, a number of interesting points that we'd like to follow up as the program progresses here. But there's an argument here in Washington over whether the toppling of President Morsi is a coup, something that White House spokesman Jay Carney describes as a complicated issue. If it is a coup, of course, U.S. law requires the government to cut off more than $1 billion in mostly military aid to Egypt. However, it was announced this week that the U.S. is going ahead with the delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Egypt, even though the Obama administration insists it is not taking sides. Was this a coup, and what are the implications for U.S.-Egyptian aid and relations?
Well, I think it's a coup. I mean, the question is, was it a military-assisted revolution, or was this something that the military had been planning all along? And I think nobody has any idea what the military had in mind. Did they see the Tamarud movement as a great opportunity to topple Morsi, or did they feel that they were responding to the people on the streets? And 22 million out of 80 is a pretty significant number. I mean, that's a quarter of all Egyptians coming out to protest their president. I think that's hard to ignore. And so at the end of the day, though, it's $1.5 billion on the line. I think that there's no way that the United States calls this a coup. We need Egypt for the upholding of the peace treaty with the Israelis. We view the Suez Canal as a huge asset that we're not willing to relinquish. And more broadly, we're concerned that Egypt sets the tone for the rest of the Middle East. We don't want to allow chaos to erupt there. It's already chaotic enough. And so this $1.5 billion will be leverage to maintain some level of stability in this crucial country.
So you're saying it's in the U.S. self-interest to ignore its own law?
I think that is what the Obama administration is going to do, unless, of course, we see continued acts of violence by the military. I think that was an eye-opener for the White House. That attack on the pro-Morsi demonstrators, killing 50 people in cold blood, it appeared that's going to be something that's very difficult for the administration to ignore if that kind of thing continues to happen.
Jonathan, you alluded to the Tamarud movement, and I want you to talk about the opposition. What does it consist of? How would you define the Tamarud movement? Who's involved? The National Salvation Front? And to what extent are people who supported Mubarak, to what extent are they part of this whole mix of the opposition? And what does that mean for any kind of a unified opposition?
Well, the Tamarud movement is by no means a homogenous one. I mean, we don't call it a secularist movement. We call it an anti-Islamist movement, which basically means that they're opposed to the way that the Brotherhood has conducted governance. As I understand it, Tamarud was founded by 4 individuals who were simply frustrated with Morsi's governance. And what I found very interesting about this movement is that they were not interested in toppling Morsi and then simply replacing him with a person or a party. What they wanted to do was to topple Morsi and then to replace him with a system, one that was more representative, one that was more inclusive, one that would allow for women and minorities and others to take part in government. And so it was very interesting. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I believe that there is some gray area about whether this was a revolution or a coup. If they wanted to install one man, Mohammed al-Baradei, or some other figure, then I would say that would absolutely look like a coup, a very non-democratic event. But what they're asking for right now is to basically reset the clock back to 2011, back to the time when Mubarak fell, to start the process over again because they believe that it has been tainted by the Brotherhood's approach to governance. So that's the good news about Tamarud. The bad news is that I think the military may have used it for their own needs, and that's the concern that we have right now, that this was exploited by the military to conduct what some are calling a coup.
Well, doesn't this so-called coup or coup-volution, no matter how popularly backed, send the wrong message to the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islamist movements that, well, when you get into power through democratic means, people have a right to undemocratically remove you because they don't like the direction you're going. I mean, this is the concern, the message it sends and the implications.
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, you elect somebody president. If you don't like him, you're stuck with him for 4 years.
Right. Right. I mean, this was basically flaunting institutions that, again, that the Egyptians fought very hard to create after the fall of Hosni Mubarak. And so this does not look like the Egyptian people respected these institutions. Certainly the military did not respect them. And it gives a sense that the rule of law is absent in Egypt. This is what is of great concern to all of us. I think historically now you need to take a look at the fact that this is not the only time that's happened in recent years. Hamas also won an election in 2006. They were overturned. It was basically a coup that happened there. And so the message consistently to the Islamists in the region is you can win at the ballot box, but we can still topple you from power if we don't like what you do. Now, I would also argue this, is that opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood are also saying that this may have been a mistake. Not only are they concerned about the erosion of institutions, but they also wanted to have the Muslim Brotherhood stay in power longer to continue to demonstrate how inept they were in governance. In other words, what many people would argue is that the Brotherhood has been saved. They now look like martyrs. They now look like, that they were toppled from power and they're the aggrieved party as opposed to those who were flaunting Egypt's nascent democratic institutions.
The public prosecutor there has ordered the arrest of the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Badia and some other senior Islamists, accusing them of inciting violence when, as we've mentioned, this dawn clash between Morsi supporters and the army left more than 50 people dead in Cairo. Are you expecting a mass crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, and what are the implications of that?
I think the army is going to have to tread very carefully. It cannot have the appearance of just simply rounding up people without cause. That's exactly the kind of thing that could prompt the United States to step in and perhaps cut aid. And I think that's the kinds of conversation that's taking place quietly behind the scenes with the White House and this new military rule. That said, I do expect some of the leaders to remain behind bars. We've heard news of Khairat al-Shatter, who's a prominent figure within the Brotherhood and a financier of the movement, that he's been arrested, that the Supreme Guide is now wanted. We've heard that Mohammed Morsi himself is now in a safe location, but he's not under arrest. But again, we don't get a sense that there is a transparent process for all of this. If Muslim Brotherhood figures are wanted, what are they wanted for? And again, I think the military needs to be very careful about what message they send. Is it illegal to be part of the Muslim Brotherhood? At one point it was. Now it's not. And so there's a lot of confusion. Again, it's these questions of rule of law that I think are really going to dog us in the coming months.
You're listening to Press Conference USA on the Voice of America. Our guest is Jonathan Schanzer. He's Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a policy group based here in Washington. He's a specialist on the Middle East and North Africa. We're talking about the turmoil in Egypt. I'm Carol Castiel, along with VOA Senior Middle East Correspondent Meredith Buell. And this is a reminder that Press Conference USA is also available online as a podcast. Please visit our website at voanews.com/PCUSA. And as always, we love to hear from you. So please send us an email with your feedback to pcusa@voanews.com.
Carol, could I just follow up his last question,
Sure.
or his last answer, if you don't mind? I'm just interested in your take on what is the future of Mr. Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Will it back down, or will it confront the Egyptian military?
It's, I think, probably one of the more fascinating questions to ask right now. In recent days, I have observed a fissure within the Muslim Brotherhood. You have the traditional old guard. These are people, you have to recall, they've been waiting 80 years to come to rule after being designated as an illegal organization, crackdowns by the Mubarak regime, etc. And what we're seeing right now is that these are the people who refuse to go quietly into the night. And then what we have is the emergence of a young guard within the Brotherhood. These are people who are saying that they're not necessarily concerned about Morsi himself, but they want to take part in the democratic process. So it's this young guard, this potentially more moderate faction within the Brotherhood that appears to be breaking from the mothership, so to speak. And so that is a very interesting thing to watch. I can't tell you which way the movement is going to go, but I do think that it's going to be critical that the Brotherhood continues to take part in the political system. In other words, what the Turmoil movement was complaining about was that the Brotherhood was not inclusive during its 1 year of rule. If this new system is to be successful, they're going to have to be inclusive as well. They're going to have to make sure that the Brotherhood and other Islamists take part. The question is, of course, whether the Brotherhood wants to. The young guard does, the old guard they're calling for an intifada. We'll have to see which faction wins out, or if in fact they break from one another.
Jonathan, how would you evaluate the United States' response to what's been happening?
Paralysis. And I think for probably good reason. I know there are a lot of people who are criticizing the administration, but I would say that if I were in the White House right now, I would be looking at this and on the one hand cheering, because this is the Muslim Brotherhood having discredited itself in full view of the entire Middle East. There's a lot of question about whether the Brotherhood is toxic now across other countries in the region, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I think we've been trying to do through public diplomacy for a long time, to demonstrate that political Islam is not the answer to governance, and that, true democracy, true liberal democracy, separation of church and state is the answer. So on the one hand, that's good news. On the other hand, we're paralyzed about whether this was a coup. We're unsure whether we should be continuing to give that $1.5 billion a year to the Egyptian people, whether we should continue to provide aircraft and other Abrams tanks and other weaponry to the Egyptian military. So we are now at a very interesting crossroads. I have not seen a clear answer coming out of the White House. I suspect it should take several weeks or even months before we get a sense of how comfortable this government is here in the United States with the new government that forms in Egypt.
I keep hearing from people in Cairo that both sides are angry at the United States and that the anti-Americanism there is the worst ever, that it's palpable on the streets. We had a young man from the Washington area stabbed in the chest who was a student there during the demonstrations. How would you describe the situation on the ground and, again, the implications for the U.S. image in Egypt and then the U.S. foreign policy?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the signs and the protests from both sides, and I would say the biggest loser is President Obama, who was seen as being too soft on Mohamed Morsi. And I would say, actually, in retrospect, I think the president or the State Department, somebody could have done something to at least criticize Morsi along the way. In other words, we were standing by silently while Morsi continued to violate the trust of the Egyptian people, and we did not have a stake in the game. Now we've had people from the State Department come out and say, in retrospect, this was bad. But in my opinion, that's a day late and a dollar short. We missed an opportunity to demonstrate to the Egyptian people that we cared about the violations that were taking place on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, now the Brotherhood is angry with us, accusing us here in the United States of having cavorted with the Turmoil movement to help bring down the Brotherhood. And so you've got this anger on both sides. It's palpable. And we joke at FDD that there's only one thing that the Egyptians hate more than the United States intervening in their affairs, and that's when we don't intervene in their affairs. I don't think that there was an easy answer, but I think that there were opportunities along the way to at least mark out a policy to say that we were unhappy about what's happening. We also could have called for sort of halfway measures. We could have called for example, early elections that might have placated both sides, at least to a certain extent. In other words, if we said, Morsi, we don't believe that you have the right to rule any longer, we are going to encourage early elections in 3 months. Would that have solved the current crisis? We don't know, but at least that was a half measure that could have been proposed that we did not.
Do you find this ironic because President Obama did go to Cairo? He did try to reach out to the Muslim world, number one. And number two, what should President Obama do now?
I don't have the answer for what the president should do now. I mean, we are now faced with thorny questions across the region, whether it's the Syrian civil war, whether it's this strange coup-evolution as we're talking about in Egypt. Nobody knows the answers to these things. I think the president is probably right to slow play it. But I do believe that the president has made some mistakes along the way, reaching out to the regime rather than the people. That was the essence of his Cairo speech in 2009. I think he's actually continuing to make that same mistake by not intervening in the affairs of Egypt while Morsi was, again, violating the trust of the Egyptian people. Again, this was the president trying to work directly with those in power rather than trying to empower those who truly deserved the system.
How do you empower people, though, who don't necessarily know what they want? They know what they're against. They don't want the heavy arm of the military, but nor do they want, or obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood, who, as you said, in the form of the president, ran roughshod over the rule of law. He gave himself extraordinary powers, etc. This speaks to the lack of cohesion among the opposition. How can we help those who do have a more secular bent or want to see the institution of the rule of law, liberties, and so forth?
Well, I think a couple things are probably worth noting here. I mean, number one, we need to support those who are looking for a new process. In other words, what Turmoil has called for is, again, not the installation of one person, which I think is always dangerous. We have this tendency to want to grab onto one personality in the region, whether an enemy or an ally, and then to hold fast to that one individual. We put all of our stock in that one individual, and it can either work out horribly or well or somewhere in between. That's not the way forward. And I think what Turmoil has showed us is that they want us to support a process, not a person or a party. Now, the issue that I find difficult right now is Turmoil is still just a movement. It's just that. It's not a political party. It's not been able to help the opposition coalesce. I still see a very muddled mass right now in the anti-Morsi opposition realm. We need to watch very carefully and perhaps even help them in a very quiet way find a way forward, find a vision. There is still no forward-looking vision among the anti-Islamist opposition.
Let's take a look at the region. As I alluded to in the introduction, you have now Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait coming out cheering, because they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They see them as a threat, and they're obviously pledging lots of money to this interim regime. And then Qatar and Turkey, on the other hand. What are the implications for the region?
Well, there's a regional battle taking place, and it actually reminds me a little bit of when the Royalists squared off against the Pan-Arabists in the 1950s and 1960s. You get a sense that this is happening again. Right now, you've got Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Emirates versus Turkey and Qatar. Turkey and Qatar are the Muslim Brotherhood bloc, so to speak. And I would say that the Muslim Brotherhood bloc has lost out, at least for now. It's not a devastating blow, but it's certainly it's a body blow. It hurt. But what's interesting to me, actually, and people are, for whatever reason, haven't noticed this. They say that this is a defeat for political Islam. I disagree with that. I mean, it's still a victory for political Islam. Saudi Arabia is the top proponents of political Islam. It's just a different brand of it. And I think that many Egyptians, they're cheering the fact that Saudis come in again. I'm not sure that that's a good thing. I mean, why is it that it has to be one or the other? It would be wonderful if we could find other patrons for Egypt that don't have an ulterior motive when it comes to political Islam.
Now, Carol's question was much more important than the one I'm about to ask, and we got to follow up on that answer. But I have to ask you this. The New York Times reported that suddenly, after the military ousted Mr. Morsi, normal people's lives in Egypt have gotten better, that gas lines have disappeared, that power cuts have stopped, the police have returned to the streets and are polite and doing their job in a correct way. I mean, is this some miracle? Or were there legions of personnel left in place after former President Hosni Mubarak was ousted, intentionally undermining Mr. Morsi's government?
That's an important question.
It's an important question, and I don't have the answers readily available for that. I think, over time that may make itself clear. But certainly there is an effort on the part of the military and on the part of the Egyptian bureaucracy to demonstrate that life is in fact better without Mohamed Morsi. And if they can continue to drive that point home, then I think there is a chance that you'll have more and more people come out in support of whatever new system takes form. Is that a good thing? I think it probably is. My concern that there was manipulation at play? Always.
Yeah, I mean, is it amazing that, again, people were very concerned about security. The police situation, the crime situation had gone way up. People were very concerned about gas lines, very concerned about power cuts. Now everything's working in Egypt. What's going on?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, part of that can also be explained by not that maybe services were being withheld, but that perhaps the military, the mukhabarat, the bureaucracy in Egypt, that they're now, it's a surge almost, that they see the importance of doing this if they want to gain the trust of the people. So you can look at it either way. Again, I don't have the answers. I couldn't tell you exactly what's going on here, but obviously there are a lot of conspiratorial minds in the Middle East, and I think you're going to have a lot of conspiracies explained to you in this way, particularly when it comes to the military.
Jonathan, as we conclude, how do you see the way forward? Do you think Egypt can somehow chart a more stable course? What is your view of the so-called roadmap that was laid out? I mean, I wonder if we put too much stock in elections, because what's really important in terms of democracy is the rule of law, institutions, civil society. Are you concerned? And what are the prospects for some sort of national reconciliation, which of course is critical for Egypt?
Well, the national reconciliation question is one that continues to come up. There's a lot of talk about Egypt descending into some sort of an Algeria-type situation. Right now, I don't see it as being quite that bad, but of course, there is a standoff between the Brotherhood and this anti-Islamist opposition. It will be obviously critical for these sides to all work together, and it's unclear whether they will be able to. I think that fissure within the Brotherhood that we mentioned earlier, I think that may dictate some of this process, and I think that's something that we'll be looking for. But the other thing that I think is crucial is the creation of a constitution in a way that is inclusive, that the Brotherhood can take part, that even the Salafists can take part, but certainly minorities across Egypt, the Copts, women, secularists, etc. That was missing during the sort of first shot of this revolution under Mohamed Morsi. There was not an inclusive governance process. Again, this was about resetting the clock back to 2011. If the clock is in fact reset and they can go forward with this constitution and then implement it properly, right? We talk about real institutions that function according to rule of law, then we've got a fighting chance.
I have to ask you about the impact this is having on Islamist groups like Hamas, for example, in the Gaza Strip, and how might it impact on Secretary of State Kerry's efforts to restart the peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians?
Great question. Hamas, I would say, is devastated right now. They had left the so-called axis of resistance where Iran and Syria were their top funders. After last year, when Hamas left Damascus in the wake of the Syrian civil war, they went running into the arms of the Muslim Brotherhood bloc. So they went to Egypt, they went to Qatar, and they went to Turkey. Now, one of those three legs from that tripod is now cut down, right? Egypt is no longer able to give them that assistance. And on top of that, the Egyptian military has shut down these smuggling tunnels, which are a key artery for what we call bulk cash smuggling. This is the way that cash gets into the Gaza Strip. And so you're looking at a severely hobbled Hamas right now, really clinging to Turkey and Qatar. And it's unclear whether that support will continue in a way that can keep Hamas afloat.
A lot more to talk about, but not enough time. Jonathan Schanzer is Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's an author and expert on the Middle East and North Africa. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your terrific insights about Egypt.
My pleasure.
Press Conference USA on the Voice of America was produced in Washington. Thanks to Anna Zalewski for booking our guest. Our engineer was Mohammed Suleibi. Joining me on the program was VOA Senior Middle East Correspondent Meredith Buell, and I'm Carol Castiel. Join me again next week for another Press Conference USA on the Voice of America.
Press Conference USA on the Voice of America. From Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the Voice of America has brought you Press Conference USA. You can email your questions or comments about this edition of Press Conference USA to pcusa@voanews.com. And to keep up with all the latest news, tune to the Voice of America on radio, television, or the World Wide Web. Join us again next week when another newsmaker speaks with journalists about the critical issues facing the United States and the world. We'll see you next week for another edition of Press Conference USA on the Voice of America.